University. My name is Bob Brinkman, and I'm the Vice Provost for Scholarship and Engagement here, and I'm also the Associate Dean for Graduate Studies. Charles Robert Darwin was born on February 12th in 1809, and each year, on or around his birthday, events like this are held to honor his life and work all over the world. Now, why Darwin, you might ask? Why not Newton Day or Einstein Day? The main reason we commemorate Darwin is for what he represents: the power of science to transcend prejudice, myth, and magical thinking, and the responsibility to see the world as it really is, and to make us accept what science shows us to be real, even if it makes us uncomfortable. Do I need to tell anyone here how important this message is right now, given that well-established scientific truths like evolution, climate change, and the effectiveness of vaccines are under attack, not because they are falsehoods, but because they are politically inconvenient or counterintuitive truths? Science gives us very powerful tools for meeting the challenges facing our society today: overpopulation, environmental degradation, antibiotic resistance, climate change, poverty, and gun violence. But increasingly, science is being denigrated when it provides answers that contradict cherished political or religious beliefs. Darwin devoted his life to pursuing a truth that he knew would upset mankind's very sense of place in the world, and it likely cost him a few friends, but he kept working at it because the evidence was undeniable. This is why we gather once a year to celebrate the life and vision of Charles Darwin and to eat some birthday cake. And I assure you there will be cake. This is, after all, a birthday celebration of Charles Darwin. So at the end, we'll actually sing happy birthday to Charles. Now, perhaps Darwin's greatest accomplishment was his discovery of a mechanism to explain evolution, which was, of course, natural selection, which has been called the single greatest idea ever. What is so great about natural selection? Well, that's what tonight's performance is all about. The greatest obstacle to accepting the idea of evolution as the source of the diversity of life on Earth comes in explaining how a non-intelligent natural process could produce living things that appear to be so intricately designed. In the human world, design is the hallmark of intelligence, and by analogy, thinkers going back thousands of years before Darwin saw the appearance of design in living things as proof of the existence of an intelligent designer. However, Darwin was not the first to question the idea that appearance of design is proof of a designer. A philosopher named David Hume raised questions about this connection in a work he called Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion in 1776. Hume died over 30 years before Darwin was born, and we have no evidence that Darwin ever read the dialogues, but we can have some fun imagining how Darwin and Hume might share an excellent, intelligent design adventure together.
Whoa, this evolution course is lit. It's got mad ideas to ponder.
Yeah, indeed, this course totally rocks. But I'm most troubled about our discussion today about intelligent design theory.
Do tell, Jacob. What is it that vexes you so?
Well, see here, I just don't understand why scientists can't accept the possibility that life had a designer. You know, I mean, when it comes about, it just seems that it's so impossible that all the biomolecules and structures have just come up out of nowhere. Cells are so intricate and they function so well. Like little tiny machines, at some point way back, somebody must have put all the pieces together. How else can you explain something to come up of nothing?
Dude, I totally get what you're saying. I, too, have puzzled over this. Every part of a cell has a purpose in the function of a most harmonious whole. Dare I say that purpose is the hallmark of living things. Bees function to pollinate the flowers, earthworms function to aerate the soil, predators function to keep prey in check, or eyes. Dude, don't get me started on eyes. They're totally awesome little 3D cameras. How did eyes just happen?
Too true. Eyes are righteously designed to carry out functions, like checking out babes.
But who might be the designer? Are we talking about the big guy?
Yo, dude, maybe it was E.T. Or like some bioengineer from the future.
Whoa, temporal paradox. Bogus.
Well, whoever it was, whatever the designer was, at least you have to accept the possibility of it. I mean, how else do you explain purposeful design in living things?
Well, I'm pretty sure Darwin explained it scientifically. I just don't quite understand how.
Yeah, well, we should totally ask him.
Forward, into the past. Dash off stage. Mr. Darwin, excuse us, good sir, but my friend and I have a most pressing question to ask you.
Good day, young gentlemen. How may I be of service to you?
Well, we are hoping you could enlighten us as to the source of the apparent design in living things. Is design proof of the existence of a creator, or does design have a material explanation?
Ah, yes. What you call design is also referred to as final cause, the purposefulness of species and their organic contrivances. The Reverend William Paley made an analogy between living things and a pocket watch. If you come across a pocket watch lying on the ground, you infer there must have existed a designer who made the watch for the purpose of keeping time. Someone who comprehended its construction and designed its use. Every manifestation of design that exists in the watch exists in living organisms, according to the good Reverend.
So, this Reverend Parsley was the first dude to prove that living things must have had a designer?
Well, not so fast, my oddly dressed young friend. The argument from design has a long history. Why, just the other day I was reading dialogues concerning natural religion by the philosopher David Hume. If I understood him correctly, Mr. Hume offered up a criticism of the argument from design about 100 years ago. I just wish I could recall it well enough to do it justice.
No worries, Darwin, dude. We can get the answer straight from the Hume's mouth.
Let's go.
Charles Darwin, meet David Hume.
An honor, sir, an honor.
So, philosopher dude, do you not agree that purposefulness and complex structure of living things implies that there's an existence of some intelligible designer?
Not so fast, my strangely dressed sir. In my dialogues concerning natural religion, my characters argue the case for God as the designer of the natural world from several points of view. Perhaps we should let my Cleanthes and Philo speak for themselves.
Philo, look around the world. Contemplate the whole and every part of it. You will find it to be nothing but one great machine, subdivided into an infinite number of lesser machines, subdivided, which themselves can be subdivided to a degree beyond what human senses and faculties can trace and explain. The curious adaptation of means to ends throughout all nature resembles exactly, though it much exceeds, the production of human contrivance, of human designs, thought, wisdom, and intelligence. Since, therefore, the effects resemble each other, we are led to infer by all the rules of analogy that the causes also resemble, and that the author of nature is somewhat similar to the mind of man. though possessed of much larger faculties, proportioned to the grandeur of the work which he has executed.
If we see a house, Cleanthes, we conclude with the greatest certainty that it had an architect or a builder. Because this is precisely the kind of effect we've seen for that kind of cause. But surely, you won't affirm that the universe has such a resemblance to a house that we can with the same certainty infer a similar cause, or that the analogy is perfect? The dissimilarity is so striking that the most you can hear pretend to is a guess, a conjecture, a presumption concerning a similar cause.
But Philo, is there really so little similarity between a house's relationship to its builder and the universe's relationship to a cause? Steps of a stair are plainly constructed so that human legs may use them in climbing. And this inference is certain and infallible. Human legs are also constructed for walking and climbing, although this inference, I allow, is not altogether so certain because of the dissimilarity which you remark. But does it therefore deserve the name only of presumption or conjecture?
But Cleanthes, did you lose your calm rationality when you compared the universe with houses and ships and furniture and machines? When you inferred from their similarity in some circumstances, the similarity in their causes? Thought, design, intelligence, such as we discover in men and other animals, is no more than one of the springs and principles of the universe, along with heat and cold, attraction and repulsion, and 100 others which fall under daily observation. What peculiar privilege has this little agitation of the brain we call thought, that we must thus make it the model of the whole universe?
Consider the anatomy of the eye. And tell me, survey its structure and contrivance, and tell me from your own feeling, if the idea of a contriver does not immediately flow in upon you with a force like that of something that is right in front of you. The most obvious conclusion surely is in favor of design.
How then should we understand the cause of that being, whom you suppose is the author of nature? Have we not the same reason to trace its cause back to some further cause, or to an intelligent principle? But if we stop, and go no further, why go that far? Searching for causes, why not stop at the material world? How can we satisfy ourselves without going on infinitely? If our material world rests on some earlier cause, that cause must rest on some other, and so on, without end. It's better, therefore, never to look beyond the present material world. When you go one step beyond this straightforward answer, you only create a question that is impossible to answer. For example, a tree bestows order and organization on new trees that grow from its seeds, without knowing the order. An animal in the same manner on its offspring, and a bird on its nest. Examples of this kind are even more common in the world than examples of order arising from reason or contrivance. To say that all this order in animals and vegetables derives ultimately from design is begging the question. Nor can your point be proven without proving that both order is always the product of thought and that it can never be the product of matter alone.
So be it, Philo. But one great advantage of theism is that it is the only understanding of the universe which can be made intelligible and complete and yet can at the same time preserve a strong analogy to what we every day see and experience in the world. The comparison of the universe to a machine made by humans is so obvious and natural, and is justified by so many instances of order and design in nature that it must immediately strike every unprejudiced person's understanding and earn the approval of everyone. Whoever attempts to weaken this theory of an intelligent designer cannot pretend to succeed in replacing it with another theory that is as precise and determinate. There is no such theory.
Touche, Mr. Hume. If I catch your meaning, drawing an analogy between a human artifact like a pocket watch and a natural object like a butterfly is not enough to prove they came from the same cause.
Precisely. In fact, a watch and a living thing are really quite different, made from different materials and functioning according to different mechanisms. Both are intricate in structure and both function towards a purpose, but these similarities alone do not prove a common cause.
Okay. I totally concede that point. But, Cleanthes scores when he states that an intelligent designer makes our understanding of the natural world intelligible and complete. Why not accept God as the designer of living things? What other explanation is there that can account for the butterflies, eyes, and for all the other examples of living machines out there?
Well, as Philo points out, from a philosophical perspective, positing God as the creator of the natural world doesn't solve the question. It only displaces it.
All right. As in, who created God? And then, who created the creator of God? And who created the creator of the creator of God? And then, who created the creator of the creator?
Yes, we get your meaning. All the complexity requires an intelligent designer, and the intelligent designer of this complex material world himself is complex. Then we are embarked on an infinite regress of explanations. Better to stop with the material world. If we can account for material complexity with material causes, we need look no further.
But how can unintelligent material, the material that causes, create complexity we see in all living things, I remain most unconvinced.
And well, you should be unconvinced, my skeptical friend, for I have no alternative explanation to offer you. I cannot begin to explain how complex living beings come into existence through the operation of material causes. I can only point out the philosophical problems inherent in postulating an intelligent designer. I have no alternative.
But I believe that I have worked out an alternative explanation that relies only on the facts and principles of living beings observed in nature. I came upon the idea studying the production of different varieties of domesticated animals through the action of selective breeding. Can the principle of selection, which we have seen is so potent in the hands of man, apply in nature? I think that it can act most effectively.
But intelligent humans are doing the selecting when breeding pigs and goats or new varieties of corn. Who's doing the selecting in nature?
Think about how variable offspring are. No two siblings are ever exactly alike, and how strong the hereditary tendency is. Seeing that variations useful to man have undoubtedly occurred in crops and domesticated animals, it is not hard to imagine that other variations useful to organisms in the great and complex battle of life should sometimes occur in the course of thousands of generations. Remember, many more individuals are born than can possibly survive. If such useful variations do occur, can we doubt that the individuals having any advantage, however slight, over others would have the best chance of surviving and of procreating their kind? On the other hand, we may feel sure that any variation in the least degree harmful would be rigidly destroyed in the struggle for existence. This preservation of favorable variations and the rejection of injurious variations I call natural selection.
Okay, I totally get it. Everything is doing the selecting. Anything that has an impact on an organism's survival and reproduction affects the appearance of the next generation.
Precisely. It may be said that natural selection is daily and hourly scrutinizing throughout the world every variation, even the slightest. Natural selection rejects what is bad, but preserves and adds up all that is good. It is silently and insensibly working whenever and wherever opportunity offers, at the improvement of each organic being in relation to its organic and inorganic conditions of life. We see nothing of these slow changes in progress until the hand of time has marked the long lapses of ages.
Not so fast, Darwin, dude. I'm sorry, but how could undirected, unintelligent material, natural selection, produce something as mad complex as you and I?
I freely confess that to suppose that the eye, with all its intricate contrivances for seeing, could have been formed by natural selection seems absurd in the highest degree. However, reason tells me that if numerous gradations from a simple and imperfect eye to one complex and perfect can be shown to exist in different animals, each grade being useful to any animal under changing conditions of life, then it is reasonable to admit that a perfect and complex eye could be formed by natural selection.
But the human eye, it seems so perfect, you know? It's just like a finely crafted camera or a telescope.
Yes, it is scarcely possible to avoid comparing the eye with a telescope. We know that this instrument has been perfected by the long-continued efforts of the highest human intellects, and we naturally infer that the eye has been formed by a somewhat analogous process. But may not this inference be presumptuous? Have we any right to assume that the Creator works by intellectual powers like those of man? To imagine the evolution of the eye, we need only start with a thick layer of transparent tissue, with spaces filled with fluid, and with a nerve sensitive to light beneath. We then suppose that every part of this structure is continually varying in shape, thickness, and density. Further, we must suppose that there is a power called natural selection, or the survival of the fittest, if you like, that's always intently watching each slight variation and carefully preserving those which tend to produce a more distinct image. We must suppose, with each new state of the instrument to be multiplied by the millions, each to be preserved until a better one is produced, and then the old ones to be all destroyed. Let this process go on for millions of years, and during each year on millions of individuals of many kinds. Could not a living optical instrument thus be formed, superior to one of glass made by the intellect of man?
Come on, Jacob, you gotta admit that it's at least possible.
Okay, maybe for the eye, but what about more complex things?
Well, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. But I can find no such case.
What about those flagellar motor thingies that those dudes were arguing about in that documentary we watched in class?
Oh yeah, that was the film about the trial in Dover, Pennsylvania, over whether or not intelligent design theory could be taught as science in school. One biology dude was like, the flagellum can't be evolved, it's totally too complex. And the other biology dude was like, nuh-uh, the flagellum could totally be evolved.
Yeah.
Intelligent design is a scientific theory that proposes that some aspects of life are best explained as the result of design, and that the strong appearance of design in life is real and not just apparent. I think the best, most visually striking example of design is something called the bacterial flagellum. The bacterial flagellum is quite literally an outboard motor that bacteria use to swim, and in order to accomplish that function, it has a number of parts ordered to that effect. One part here, the filament, is actually the propeller of the bacterial flagellum. The motor is actually a rotary motor. It spins around and around and around, and as it spins the propeller, which pushes against the liquid in which the bacterium finds itself, and therefore pushes the bacterium forward through the liquid. The drive shaft is attached to the motor itself, which uses a flow of acid from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell to power the turning of the motor. Much like we say, water flowing over a dam can turn a turbine. The drive shaft has to traverse the membrane of the cell, and there are protein parts, which act as what are called bushing materials to allow the drive shaft to proceed through. And it's really much more complex than this. But I think this illustration gets across the point of the purposeful arrangement of parts. Most people who see this and have the function explained to them quickly realized that these parts are ordered for a purpose and therefore bespeak design. We infer design when we see that parts appear to be arranged for a purpose. The strength of the inference is quantitative. The more parts that are arranged, the more intricately they interact, the stronger is our confidence in design.
Dr. Behe has made it very clear what I think is fairly called his biochemical argument for design. This argument depends upon a much bolder claim that simply saying that scientists have not completely explained how the flagellum has evolved. The reason Dr. Behe says that evolution cannot explain the origin of structures like the flagellum is because they have a property that he calls irreducible complexity. His argument is that if you have a multi-part system and all the parts are necessary to function, you can evolve that system one part at a time and gradually build up the complex system because there is no function possible until the last part is snapped into place. Therefore, we ought to be able to take the bacterial flagellum and break its parts down and discover that none of the parts are good for anything except when they are all assembled in a flagellum. Evolutionary theory holds, however, that when you look at these irreducibly complex structures, we ought to be able to find parts of those systems that actually do have useful functions within them. If Dr. Behe is correct, if we take away even one part, there should be no function. But I'm going to propose that we take away not one, not two. I'm going to propose that we take away 30 parts. And what I'm going to propose to do is take 30 of those proteins away and see what is left. The parts that I have removed are on the outside and the inside. And what are left are 10 proteins that span the inner and outer membrane. Well, it turns out that what is actually left behind with those 10 remaining proteins is a little structure known to microbiologists as the type 3 secretory system. So it's very clear that a subset of those proteins has an entirely different function, a beneficial function for the bacterium, and a function that can and is favored by natural selection. So when we take apart a complex multi-part system such as the bacterial flagellum, the prediction made by Dr. Behe from irreducible complexity is we should have no useful functions. Any irreducibly complex structure missing a part is, by definition, non-functional. We follow that up. We do break it apart, and lo and behold, we find a variety of useful functions, one of which I have just pointed out, which is type 3 secretion. What that means, in ordinary scientific terms, is that the argument that Dr. Behe has made is falsified. It's wrong. It's time to go back to the drawing board.
I can't believe that in spite of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, the design argument is still alive and kicking.
And most righteously so. I find it totally compelling. The closer you look at the living organisms, the more they look like they're made out of tiny machines. You have to at least admit the possibility the hand had a creator and a designer at work at some point in the past. Maybe evolution won't be able to explain everything about living cells.
I had hoped that natural selection would at least convince my colleagues in the natural sciences that there is a way to arrive at design without an intelligent designer. But as I might have guessed, it appears that not all are convinced of my reasoning.
Despair not, Darwin, dude. 150 years after your weighty tome on the origin of species, natural selection is almost universally accepted as the only scientific explanation for the appearance of design in living things. You have much to be proud of.
But it seems that after 250 years, the appearance of design and or the desire to see the handiwork of the Almighty in living things is strong enough to keep the debate alive, perhaps for another 250 years.
Well, that was quite the performance for Darwin Day. Now we have time for questions. We have all of these great characters throughout history and our students represented to ask anything that you might want to on intelligent design, on evolution, and the various other topics we discussed today.
Surely someone has a question for Mr. Darwin or Mr. Hume.
Yes. Can you come to the microphone?
I wanted to ask Michael Behe and Ken Miller about irreducible complexity. And I think you alluded to the fact that the proteins in the bacterial flagellum had alternative functions when displaced, when separated from the flagellum. Could you enlighten us a little bit about that? Do those proteins have alternative functions?
They are meant for a purpose, to be part of one design. So that's what they're there for. Would you care to address why they might work alone? Do they work alone?
They do work alone. We talked about that secretory system, and some of them are playing a completely different role in that brand new structure that we talked about, which is not a brand new structure. It is a structure that is shared among many, many different organisms that you know well about. Dr. Behe. Oh, wait, we have input from
I think if I understand correctly, the issue here is over an assumption that a particular morphological attribute in an organism functions for a purpose in the present organism, and there's an assumption that in evolving that function, the contrivance had to be assembled all at once. And the idea that many people don't think about is that you can create or build something for one function and then later on adapt it for a different function. So, for example, the example that
the mousetrap, yes.
It does not work without all of its parts. So the mousetrap is a perfect example of my hypothesis, because without any of the parts of the mousetrap, it doesn't work. You need all the parts to function in the way that it does. If you take away the spring will not catch a mouse. If you take away the board doesn't catch a mouse. Nothing works without all those pieces being intricately put together in the way that they are supposed to.
What happens if I take one part of the mousetrap and two parts away, and then I have something that I can use as a clipboard, or something that I can use as a tie clip? If I was wearing a tie, I just so happen to be wearing a very nice Darwin tree on my shirt and no tie. But if I had a tie, I would take your mousetrap minus 3-4 parts and use it as a clipboard, as a tie clip.
I don't buy it.
Other questions?
How do you think an argument would have gone between Darwin and Lamarck?
Well, I'm quite familiar with the work of Mr. Lamarck, and I have no quarrel. I think that the inheritance of acquired characteristics is a potentially reasonable and possibly demonstrable mechanism for evolutionary change. In my work, I have discussed it, and I have not discounted it. I believe that natural selection is a more powerful and a more effective explanation, but certainly there is room for Mr. Lamarck's mechanism. You,
So,
my oddly dressed young friend.
yes, thank you. I was checking out all those babes before, so I got a little lost in thought. Anyways, one of the things that we were talking about on our trip to the Galapagos was in this book that we read, there was actually an island called Daphne Major where there was a group of birds and they were able to see evolutionary change over time in the population through different climatic shifts over that island. What would you say to the fact that your research is actually getting proven or is looking like it's quite accurate long after you've passed away? Or you're still doing fine, I guess.
Well,
Happy 208th.
I'm certainly happy to hear that someone is doing a better job researching the finches of the Galapagos Islands than I did. I'm afraid that when I was in the Galapagos, I didn't bother to even label which island I collected my finches from. I, at that time, was thinking more like a creationist than an evolutionist, and it didn't occur to me right away that there would be any reason to find different species of finches on different islands that were so close to each other and so similar in characteristics. So I simply collected finches thinking that all the finches in the Galapagos would be the same. And it wasn't until I got back to London that an eminent ornithologist, Mr. Gould, informed me that in fact my finches from different islands were different species. A fact that I found most remarkable and difficult to explain from the viewpoint of a creator.
Thank you.
All right, so my question is for you, Mr. Darwin. You mentioned how there are variations in species, and there are positive variations and negative variations. Now, and the negative variations tend to be eroded over the struggle of existence. Now, human beings in modern times have turned the struggle into existence into something close to a utopia, and these deleterious variations arise and they're not stamped down to some extent. How has this altered natural solutions' effect on human populations?
That's a very, very interesting question. I'm afraid that I don't much understand the source of variation. I worked tirelessly in my researches to demonstrate variation. I studied barnacles. Barnacles are found by the thousands on rocks, and each barnacle looks exactly the same as every other barnacle. But I found over 5 years of work with barnacles that, no, each barnacle was different. If you look closely enough, you always found variation. Variation was everywhere. And to the point where it was difficult sometimes to draw a boundary between one species of barnacle and another. You could always find a few barnacles of one species that were starting to look quite a bit like a few barnacles in a different species. But I have no idea where all this variation comes from. And I'm afraid I can't speak to the conditions that exist after my time. Perhaps someone else could comment on human evolution in what century are we in?
I know the answer. It was designed. It's God's plan.
Oh, I gave the microphone.
And the question was?
How is natural selection working or not working in your world, in your modern world?
Well, we see it everywhere. We see it everywhere, even right now in microbial diversity. Right? We see it in all the different organisms that have been in.
Specifically humans. Are humans subjected to natural selection?
All the time. Through disease, through evolutionary.
If I were to argue the point of view that I don't believe it, which is not true, I think what I would say is that one of the fundamental principles of humans and our ability is that we actually are able to alter our environments much more so than any other organism on this planet. So for example, how many of you wear glasses or some form of contact lenses? If you think back to the tribal days where you had to hunt for your food, how many of you think you'd be able to survive if we'd had invented glasses or contact lenses, right? So one of the abilities that we have is to cure disease, to cure afflictions. So natural selection doesn't have as great of a force in today's world for humans as it does for other organisms that are not able to change their surroundings. But again, I don't really believe that's actually happening.
Why haven't we found any transitionary forms in the fossil record?
Well, I can speak to that. One of the most remarkable things that I experienced in my life was shortly after the publication of On the Origin of Species. A most remarkable transitional fossil was discovered in Germany. It was an animal that had feathers and wings and was clearly a bird, but teeth and claws and scales like a reptile. And I can't think of a more brilliant transitional form than Archaeopteryx, half bird, half reptile. And I'm sure many more examples have come to light since my time.
I can actually shine some light on that. I'm a student in the modern era, as you can clearly see, and there are definitely some transitional fossils that are worth noting. One of them, we can actually find the first four-limbed animals that are somewhat reminiscent of fish and modern amphibians. And there was actually a really interesting book published on it called Your Inner Fish, which goes through how you are actually reminiscent of previous forms that aren't exactly gone and haven't disappeared completely, but we still have transitional forms all over the world today. And there are plenty of examples, like Archaeopteryx is a great one. It sort of transitions between reptiles and birds. And then you have this fish-like animal called Tiktaalik that was discovered in Canada. And it was a fish that actually walked on all fours and made it onto land. And it's that body plan that we have today, so we can thank Tiktaalik, this fish, for actually giving us our body plan.
But why do we have so little examples if there have been plenty of fossil records?
So if I may address that, again, I agree with you, but one of the issues with gaps in the fossil record is, one, it needs to be a trait that can be fossilized, right? So we can't fossilize soft tissue or anything of that nature. We can only fossilize hard structures. Two, just because there's a gap in the fossil record doesn't mean the fossil doesn't exist. We didn't find fossils of snakes that actually had limbs until, I think, 2001, I think, was the first fossil. And after that, we started finding more examples. Typically, when you find a gap, you start finding more and more examples of it. But because you haven't found a gap yet, doesn't mean it's not necessarily out there. So we still hypothesize that it's there because we have the endpoints, and we try to look for it to fill in. Tiktaalik is another perfect example. We hypothesized that that existed, but we didn't find the fossil until, anybody remember?
2000 and, what, 7? 2000. All right.
Yeah, when was it?
Either 2007, 2009, I guess.
Yeah, so it was only within the past decade or so, but we had been looking for a long time. So those are some of the reasons that you don't see all of the gaps. And the other thing is that anytime you do fill in a gap, you still have a gap. So the argument that, we don't have gaps, so there must not be an actual fossil there, you are always going to have a gap. Because then once you fill one in, you're going to say, okay, well, there still needs to be another step between the part that we do have and the part that we just found. So it's a kind of a flawed philosophy to think that way, as long as you have the endpoints. What's really important is if you hypothesize an evolutionary trajectory and you can't find a fossil of an endpoint before your beginning point, then you're still supporting the idea of evolution. The only thing people need to actually throw evolution out the door is to find a fossil of a caveman before a dinosaur fossil, right, in terms of a timeline. But we've never been able to do things like that. We can't find those fossils, suggesting that there is a timeline, even though you do have these gaps in it.
Plus, you also have to respect that it's very difficult to make fossils in the first place. There are probably 300 or 400 animals that die in an area which could possibly preserve animals and eventually become fossils. To one animal that actually does become a fossil that we discover, it's astronomical in likelihood. It's very difficult to find fossils, mostly because there are very few places that preserve them well. Plus, you have to be at the right place and the right time and knowing what you're looking at. All of these things add up to being, paleontology is a very difficult profession when you're trying to look at the vast history of life on Earth, and you're only able to take very small snapshots of sometimes even partly, like snapshots that are only partial, when you don't even find an entire skeleton, and you have to infer a lot about the world at that time.
How are humans evolving?
Molecular biologists. How are humans evolving? That's a good question. Well, one thing we know is that we're all getting taller. Even the short ones, right? If you look back at your ancestors and your families, you were typically taller than they were. That's one thing that I know. How else are we evolving? Any ideas? Lactose. That's good. We're getting better at
degradation of the colon.
What's that?
The colon is getting smaller.
So if I may break character for a minute.
No, not colon, sorry, appendix.
If you look at different populations around the world, populations where there's a long history of domesticating animals for milk and cheese, people in those populations have many copies of the gene for producing lactase, which is the enzyme that you need to digest milk. And humans have not been domesticating animals for very long, only 10,000 years or so. So that evolutionary change, the amplification of this very, very useful gene if you're eating cheese. If you don't have the ability to produce lactase, you can't digest milk and cheese. Evolution has promoted and amplified that gene in human populations where people eat milk. So that's a relatively recent evolutionary change that's happened. But in a modern society like ours, as was mentioned by these guys before, we solve our challenges technologically much faster than evolution could possibly work. It takes evolution thousands of generations to make a relatively small change in a species. We can invent a solution. Exposure to ultraviolet radiation. People who live in equatorial regions have dark skin because melanin protects you from UV exposure from intense sunlight. People who live at high latitudes tend to have light skin because where the sun is more dim, you don't want to block out the sun because you won't make enough vitamin D and other vitamins that your skin produces from sunlight. All right, so there's an evolutionary reason why some populations are dark-skinned and some are light-skinned. All right, that's a problem that evolution solved for different populations. But in the modern world, if you're a light-skinned person and you decide you want to live in the tropics, you put on clothing, you wear a hat, maybe some sunscreen, problem solved. If you're a dark-skinned person and you want to live up in the Arctic, you take vitamin D tablets, problem solved. So technologically, we solve the challenges of survival now orders of magnitude faster than evolution would be able to solve them.
Thank you. One more question, and then I have one last question, and then we'll sing happy birthday and break for cake.
We're in trouble now.
I also love the example of wisdom teeth. They're disappearing because we don't need them anymore. So a lot of people are born without them, or they come in sideways, or they don't come in at all. But my question is for Dr. Behe. Mr. Darwin, I'm entirely impressed with the fact that you've learned so much and came to understand so many facts about natural selection with the limited amount of knowledge that you had about actual biological processes and patterns of inheritance. And yet, Dr. Behe, you are a molecular biologist, I believe?
Yes, by training I am.
Yeah, so how can you look at genes and cells and all the wonderful things under a microscope and see the similarity of these patterns across different forms of life and still think,
I'm glad you brought that up.
yeah, you're just a knucklehead?
Because I actually, did I not let you finish? Please.
No, how could you not believe that it all just arose systematically by natural selection?
I'm glad you asked that question.
This doesn't fit there.
So, one of my tenets is not that I don't believe that evolution happens. I actually do believe that evolution happens, but it only happens on designs that are pre-made. And then you get small modifications along the way. And this is why you see the similarities that you speak of. Because everything was made with this machine that works this way, and then you put them in their individual environments, and they will get these slight variations within those environments. That's how intelligent design works.
All right, I have one last question for Cleanthes and Philo. Given your experience in your philosophical framework of understanding nature, what is your interpretation of what Charles Darwin brought the modern world?
That filled in the missing theory that we discussed we didn't have. So Cleanthes challenged me to show how it could be possible that order could be produced by something other than mind, and we didn't know in the 18th century, not until we had a mechanism described by this guy over here.
I concede he proved me wrong. I didn't want to give this guy any credence, but this guy did it. So thank you, Charles Darwin.
All right, on that note, it's almost time for cake, but we always do a singing of happy birthday to Charles Darwin, and we're going to use the full name, Charles Darwin, when you get to the fill in the name part, because sometimes you go Darwin or Charlie or Darwin Dude was, I think, one of them. So here we go. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Charles Darwin. Happy birthday to you. There we go. So we do have cake. I'm not, Charles, are you cutting the cake? And please come up and get a piece and hang around and talk with our cast. We have quite an illustrative group up here. So thank you all for coming very much.
Hi.
I'm living for the